that was not by Alice Guy. This presentation aims at introducing the research led by the Cinémathèque's head curator of the collection, Laurent Manoni, and his fellow researcher, Maurice Giannetti, who wrote a book. Maybe Céline can show the book if she has it. In particular, they worked in particular on the role of Alice Guy at Gaumont and her work on the phonocene. And we will see that identifying Alice Guy's phonocene is as difficult sometimes as identifying other films because none of the films were signed. So we'll see how we can work on that. And Manoni's and Giannetti's work is based mainly on various archives, but in a good part on the Cinémathèque. And I would like to introduce to you quickly the archive of what we have at La Cinémathèque. In fact, how did we happen to have such a huge collection by Louis Gaumont, Lyon and Louis Gaumont at Cinémathèque? It's because by the mid-50s, Louis Gaumont decided to start a research and a quest on his father's work and company, because there was a film history exhibition that was curated by both La Cinémathèque and FIAF at the time, and this exhibition really disappointed Louis Gaumont, the son of Léon Gaumont, because he thought that his father's company was not well represented, and decided to do his own exhibition, and that eventually never occurred and happened. But the archive we have, so the huge, massive amount of files and boxes, is organized the way the exhibition was supposed to be displayed. And it's during this process that he contacted Alice Guy. In fact, Alice Guy had remained in contact with Léon Gaumont all over the years when she was in the United States, when she went back to France and she was like struggling economically. And what happened is that Louis Gaumont sent her catalogs where she tried to mark and to remember the films she shot at the time. And if he did not do an exhibition, nevertheless, in 1957, he did a conference in which he really insists on a role in film history and for the phonocene. Of course, we are not the only one having a great archive here. It's just an example of a letter of the conference he gave on Alice Guy. But of course, Gaumont Pathé Archive also have a tremendous collection of chronophone, phonocene, and documents. And please, if you can, we give you the link at the end of the conference. Have a look there, because they also restored phonocene, because the one you've seen had no sound, but they did the work, they found the sound and the disc, and they did a new synchronization. So we encourage you to have a look. And Céline, for you, for the technical part.
Thank you, Wafa. Yes, so unfortunately, as Wafa said, we won't be able to hear a phonocene today, but they are really accessible easily at the Gaumont Pathé Archive website. And I would like to focus now on the difference between a phonocene and the film parlant, because it's so film parlant means literally a film that speaks, a soundy film. I don't know what is the expression, but it's not the same. Phonocene basically is a system, the first system that was officially patented with this name in 1903. It includes, first the films were shown with cylinders, and little by little, the system had different levels of evolution. So there are many, many patents that Léon Gaumont published about the phonocene. So I won't be able to talk about all the patents today, and maybe Martin aussi will be able to help me on that later, because it's a very complex system that will influence many other systems later. So the phonocene is a playback system. Basically, what happened? Maybe on the next slide, we have an example. Yes. So it looks like that. We have a projector that is connected actually with the phonograph. This one has just one horn. It's important, remind it, because I will talk about another system later. And you see a control box in the middle that is connecting both the phonograph and the projector. So this control box is very important. Not only that, but this is one of the devices that helps to really makes the synchronization work during the performance of the artist in front of the camera or during the screening. Wafa will talk about it later, but we have to say that there were some famous artists that were recorded, but many of them were not famous. So Lyon Gaumont was a sort of hacker, and he was taking commercial discs of famous people like Caruso, but we'll talk about it later, and he was putting the song on unfamous artists. But on this case here, Mayol, this is the cases where we really have the real artist on screen with the real music and the real song. Mayol was one of the artists the most shot in some way by Alice Guy, because he was quite famous in the musical with Paulin and Ranem, two other men. But Alice Guy also shot women like Mademoiselle de Moulins, Madame Cora Dettier, or Madame Lina Landi. In this case, if you go to the Gaumont-Paty archive website, you can listen to the song, but also you can notice that it's a color film because on the catalogs of the Phonoscenes, you have the choice in between a black and white film and the color film. The color film obviously was much more expensive. It was a stencil system. We have to say that also the shooting, when we had to shoot a Phonoscene, the camera, the system of the camera was also connected with the phonograph. It's the control box that I showed before. This is not Leo Gaumont who really patented this box. This is Oskar Mester, which is a German engineer. And they both collaborated in some patents. This was an agreement in between both of them. That I won't go too much into that agreement, but basically Oskar Mester was not selling his own disc by himself in France. He was selling it through the Catalogue Gaumont. The camera that was used also for the Phonoscene was a John Prestwich, which was not a Gaumont camera until 1910. So basically, we, according to Janetti's research, the Phonoscene recording started at least officially, let's say, in 1905, because this is where the first numbers, because each film had a number, appeared on the catalogs. There were tests, many tests before. Even Lyon Gaumont shot himself making a sort of publicity about a camera with a Phonoscene system, but that was before, and the system was not yet exactly on a good synchronized. It was working, but basically 1905 was the year. In the next slide, maybe we can see some discs. So the film parlant, I forgot to talk about it. Yeah, what is the difference with film parlant? Film parlant appeared later, and we see one of them on this slide. Basically, the film parlant was a great improvement because this was a direct sound system. That means that the actors could talk in front of the camera or sing in front of the camera, and it was recorded during the performance. So it was not anymore a playback system. The device is more complex, of course. We know that Gaumont had a sort of booth in a big box in wood in front or near the artist with a big horn recording them, because the sound was going to the horn and then was captured by microphone, and then a stylus was engraving the song on a cylinder. So that was quite complex, but it was working. I won't go too much about, I won't talk about much about this system because obviously Alice Guy didn't work with the film Parlant, but it's good to know the difference. Also, the difference was the length, because Phonoscène was in between 40 meters and 80 meters length, which means in minutes, it's very short, it's 2 or 3 minutes. It's like a video clip, early video clip. And so the discs were in between 5 to 8 francs. They were in between, in terms of diameters, they were in between 10 and 11 inch. So in the next slide, back
sorry. It's going backward. I don't know why. Sorry. No, I don't know why. Sorry.
So I'm going to talk about the 1902 patent. What Gaumont really provided, because I mentioned that Oscar Mester was the one patented the control box, but at the beginning, Gaumont really presented a revolutionary projector, that had what we call a differential system. That means that this differential system that had 2 wheels could correct during the projection the synchronization by putting the film by rewinding or forwarding a little bit to always adjust a little bit if the synchronization was lost for whatever reason, because of course the gramophones of this time and phonograph were not perfect, and the projector were probably also not perfect. But a great thing also is that we can see in the next slide the complete system. The great thing is that Gaumont also created, I don't know if it was his idea, but he created a start on the film and on the disc. So the disc had a sort of bell for the projectionist to hear, and also the film had a punch mark or something to create the start. Which is also, it explains why there were no title on the films. It has to be very precise, frame by frame, with the disc. So Gaumont couldn't add an intertitle or a credit on the film. I will show you later how we did for showing the credits. But first, in 1905, another revolutionary system appeared. It was the chronomegaphone. LG phone was the other name. So that means that the system had 2 horns. Remember the photography with the 1 horn device. Now we had 2 horns. It was actually really great, because the critique that was made to the phonoscène and the chronophone first, it was that we couldn't hear really well the sound in the theater. With the chronomegaphone and the 2 horns, the amplification sound system was working much better. And also, we have to say that it was put behind the screen. So it was also a very good contribution of Gaumont on the dispositif of the theater. So the LG phone or chronomegaphone had 2 evolutions. It had acetylene gas inside it for combustion. So it was made with flames. So the vibes and the flames were the vibration of the sound were created by the flames. But the easier system that was bought by many people that had theater were the one with the pressurized air, because it was maybe also safer to have it. So this combination made a huge difference. So for the phonoscène, and maybe that's why in 1905, the catalogs started to be printed by Leo Gaumont, and the film started to be really shot in the studio. Maybe we can see in the next slide the pictures. Oh yeah, no, sorry, it's not the studio yet. But here is pictures of slides, glass slides, like a magic lantern system in some ways, that was actually put into the projector. So it was called a passe-vue. there were many of them also in America, so I'm sure many of you know this system, but it was a way for Gaumont to have a credit on the films before the screening. Otherwise, as I said, we were losing the synchronization if the credit was put on directly on the film. So it's part of an interesting collection. We can see also that not all the time the artists were credited on the slides, which makes it even more difficult to identify in some cases. So maybe in the next slide, we see the Gaumont Studio. So it's also the same year, basically, that the big, huge studio in Les Buttes-Chaumont was finished. I mean, was in process to be finished by Léo Gaumont. It was really finished probably in 1906. This is a studio that included a shooting studio and also all the lab processing. There was also a sound studio, but it was not always used for all the phonosens. As I said, Gaumont was taking also disc coming directly from the commerce, the general distribution. Maybe in the next slide, we can see also how Gaumont tried to expand the system. Of course, he wanted to sell it to other countries. So there were phonosens in English. And then for this case, there was a studio in London that was used for the sound recording. But Gaumont was also making some of them in Italian and in Russian. Something that we have to know is that Léon Gaumont organized a huge, a very interesting, actually, exhibition projection in NYC, New York City, in 1913. And you can see it in the next slide with the new device, the chronomegaphone. So we are already out of the time of Alice Guy being in France. She's already in the United States when this huge device arrived. But it's interesting to show because here we can see that with a double record player, Léon Gaumont could show films that were longer. So, and that was the device that was made for the film parlant, where it could record actors making sketches, people also making some big speech. And one of the films that he showed in New York City in the 39th Street Theater was a big monologue called Le Commissaire et Bon Enfant, which was a 20-minute movie. So this device is at Cinémathèque Française. There is another one at Musée des Arts et Métiers in France, but as far as we know, there are only 2 of them in the world. So I will leave Wafa pursuing this presentation about Alice Guy and the phonosens.
Thank you. So Alice Guy and the phonosen, in fact, the correspondence is a very, correspondence that we keep at the Cinémathèque is a very important primary source to try to determine when Alice Guy started her filmmaking and which film can be identified as her own directing. And in fact, as you know, there are some discussion about the beginning of Alice Guy, and the same problem applies to the phonosen, because sometimes there's some contradiction between interviews, letters, and some technical issues, but maybe this question will be addressed later by Clara and Kim. For example, Alice Guy said most of the time that she started doing phonosen in 1902, as we have just seen with Céline. It does not seem to be possible because it wasn't, the system was not really perfect at the time, but it's more likely that she really started to shoot them in 1905, but we think that earlier she must have taken part to the process of elaboration of the system. What we know for sure is that, just a reminder, you know, Alice Guy entered Gaumont Company in 1895 as a secretary, and little by little, step by step, she became the director of film production, and she really imposed a shift in the production by introducing fiction starting from 1902. We see how important she was, and this her importance was also a problem inside Gaumont, especially in her relationship with René Decaux, the technical director of Gaumont. But what we know is that in 1905, in November 1905, she was sent to Spain to shoot some phonoscene there. And that's one of the first say tracks of her shooting phonoscene. But what happened was that we thought, or it is so, and she thought, and maybe her and Louis Gaumont thought, that she was sent to Spain to be put aside from Paris, and so René Decaux could gain more influence rather than her. And what happened, and it's quite interesting when you see Florida to see that the first phonoscene she shot were Spanish dances, because she was asked and requested to shoot in Spain Spanish and gypsy dances that were very in fashion at the time. But what happened is that she had technical problem shooting the films, because they were the camera and the sound system were not well synchronized. So at the end of the day, the film were not kept as phonoscene, but were available in the general catalog of Gaumont. And just about the Spanish craze and fashion, what is quite interesting is to remember that at the time, both in literature, opera, and ballet, the topic was really in fashion, and that it was a time of this dancer, La Belle Otero, was very popular. And, you know, she made some dance for Mesguich in 1896. And it was really, really present. And later, even in France, this fashion will go on. If you think of the Spanish Fiesta by Germaine Dulac, or Sun and Shadow by Musidora, the Spanish dance is really still very pregnant and influential in this. And we can see on these pictures that the mise en scène in Florida really looks like the way she shot them at the time. So if I can, yep, no. While she was stuck in Spain trying to shoot phonoscene, the first phonoscene was shot in France by René Decaux, and this is one of the first one, which was a cakewalk, and I'm showing you a cakewalk for a reason you will understand very quickly, which was another very important dance or fashionable dance at the time. But there is some discussion, in fact, between Alice Guy, and Alice Guy says in her memoirs that she shot this film, but it seems to be likely impossible because it was a time when she was in Spain. So, but it's interesting that she thought she did it. So it's kind of very difficult, as for the other film, to know exactly which film Alice Guy did. And we can see here, it's a page of a list sent by Louis Gaumont to her, and she did some annotation with some numbers, and she's trying to remember the film she did. And what we can see is that according to Giannati, she shot between 90 to 110 phonoscene in a whole between 1905 and 1907 when she left for the US. So in fact, if we have a look at the catalogs, we can see that maybe like from number 44 to 49, that's her phonoscene, then from number 71, and then between 120 and 130 must be also her work. Here it's an example of the catalog you can find at La Cinémathèque of the phonoscene, so you can see a lot of dance, and here are numbers like they are among, especially the first line of the catalog must be films that she shot herself, for sure. So Now, Alice Guy and the women performers. What is quite interesting when we have a look at those catalogs is to realize that, and here, Ben, you have to be ready to screen the film when I tell you, is that we see that the catalog are really full of male performers, and most of the time they are named, while there are less examples of female performers, and they are not always named, and most of the time they are in a group. So it also appeared that Léon Gaumont was more inclined to hire male star singer as of the time. Céline, I talked to you about some of them before. And also another thing that was quite important at the time was that, no, not now, stop. It's a little too early, Ben. Is that, thank you. Sorry, is that they will use the soundtrack will be someone famous like Caruso, but the person on screen showing, like singing, playback was not a star, was someone completely unknown. And just before we screen the film, it's like, it promises it's going to be in a few seconds. Alice Guy, we have to understand that Alice Guy, as many other directors of the time, and for the sake of the success of the phonoscene, that were a new technology and expensive one, she really used the porosity between the world of the stage, such as musical, theater, opera, and the film industry. And that's why just now we would like to show you some film clips of films that were not made by Alice Guy, but that we can see can be related to later phonoscenes. So Ben, if you can screen the film now, it would be perfect. Thank you. So the first clip, you might recognize it, is a Méliès film called The Infernal Cakewalk. And it's a film of 1903. And Cakewalk was really a fashionable dance that was shot by Lumière and many other companies. And it was, here you can see that Méliès is using some blackface dancer to imitate the dancers that were at the Nouveau Cirque. And you have already seen some of the pieces, like an extract of the catalogue of Gaumont showing one of the first phonoscene. Here it's an extract of the Phono Cinémathèque. So Phono Cinémathèque is one of the first attempts of the sound synchronization with film that were made in 1900, so very early, for the World Exhibition in Paris. And here we have two very famous dancers of the time, the Mott sisters, dancing a Louis XV dance. And finally, it's La Zambelli, also in the Phono Cinémathèque system, which was sound and film, together dancing a piece of Sylvia, which was a very famous ballet at the time. So it's here, I'll let you enjoy. And these films were restored by Cinémathèque Française and Pathé Gaumont Archive all together. Again, and they were screened recently with sound. So why am I showing you this? You might say, okay, it was before. Why is this? What's these examples? Well, it has have a reason. It's because we find exactly the same things, the same scenes, the same extract in the Gaumont catalogue phonoscene. For example, the 127 is Le Pizzicati in Sylvia. So we can see the mise en scène is different. It's with many dancers, and it was only one before. And we can see how at the time, by repeating in many different systems, there is somehow the cinema is helping to establish kind of a repertoire, a kind of best of songs, dances, etc., etc. So this was one example. And here it's the catalogue again of this ballet, Sylvia. And another things that really I thought was really interesting here would be the merging of two things. First, the cakewalk dance and the Month Sister you have just seen before dancing this weekend's dance. Because cakewalk was really the dance at the beginning of the 20th century. There were many articles, like films made about it, articles about it. Some were serious articles, some were some kind of erotic little stories about cakewalk, etc. But we can see that cakewalk was everywhere. It was so known that you could see it appear also in some fashion magazine. And who are these girls dancing the cakewalk de salon? So like kind of a stylish, well-behaved cakewalk were the Month Sisters. And in fact, when I was doing research on the cakewalk for something, I came across these two dances from the Opéra de Paris, and they really, I think, illustrate this kind of intermediality between stage and the written press and cinema all together. So here doing, and why was it so famous? It was the daughter of a photographer, a very famous photographer who was also a musician at the Opéra de Paris. So they started to be models, like here you can see them being models for Degas as child. And then later here they were famous enough to be in fashion magazine, here with one dressed as a man. And they were also like everywhere on postcards, photographed by Nadar for the one in black and white down on the left. And they were also like Alice Guy remembered, I don't know, it was very quick, but in the list of the current phonoscene she remembered shooting, she remembered the Month Sister, who was so, not only dancer, but socialite, dancing on stage in some minister salon and everything, and being on postcard. And she remembered having shot photoscene with them, and apparently that those two were an Egyptian ballet. But what is really interesting and strange for us, for Céline and I, is that they are never named in the catalog, and they are not even isolated on the image. So we are still thinking, well, and the film for the moment haven't been found. So we don't know if Alice Guy remembered well that she shot the Month Sister, or maybe it was not on this scene. But as a matter of fact, at the Cinémathèque, we haven't finished exploring our collection of phonoscenes. So I hope that in the coming year we can have we can work on the idea of preserving and identifying other phonoscenes, and that maybe we will find these dancers, the Month Sisters, like the great, maybe not so great star, but like starlets of the beginning of the 1900s. So to conclude, I will let Céline again.
Thank you, Wafa, for this great presentation. So I will be very quick. And Wafa said that it's this moment where Alice Guy was shooting phonoscenes. Of course, we don't talk much about it because we consider that phonoscenes were easy to make. They were not as gratifying than fiction. And we have to remember that Alice Guy made a sort of peplum in 1906 called La Passion du Christ, and maybe herself was not so into the phonoscene. She was more maybe interested by the production of fiction, but still I think it's a repertoire that is very important to know, and we have to continue an effort to work on this repertoire, because first, many films are lost. I don't say they have disappeared, but maybe they have been destroyed, but they are lost. That means that, as I mentioned earlier, there were no credits on the film. So even at Cinémathèque Française, we have struggled, like Florida, to identify them because there are no credits. Sometimes there's nothing written on all leaders. So we don't know what are these objects and where they are in the catalogs. So the Alice Guy also great contribution to cinema is her kind of filming herself shooting a phonoscene. So it's a famous film that you can find also on the Gaumont Pathé archive website. Here it's a photography, but she decided one day, just before leaving to the US, that she wanted to show how we were making a phonoscene. So it's a great document for historians and researchers. Also a question that I would like to ask, and maybe this is for our next panelist, Clara and Kim, is can we say that the phonoscene had also an influence on her global aesthetic later in the Solax? Can we say she had another awareness of the presence of sound in the movie, even if we know she didn't make sound movies, but there was an awareness in her experience, and maybe also an awareness with choreography, because she shot a lot of dancers. So this is a question that we can ask. Maybe no, maybe there was no big influence, but still it's a huge part of the work when she was at Gaumont. So we cannot deny that work, and I hope we can continue to do research on that topic. Thank you very much for listening to us. And we'd like to thank many people. So it's on the credit here, including Laurent Manoni, Maurice Giannati, Eric Lange, Manuela Padoan from Gaumont Pathé Archive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Céline and Wafa. I have a few points maybe to discuss or give a few informations. First, I think that it's not easy at all to film a phonoscene. And you were asking the question, but I think it's really important to underline the fact that she was giving the rhythm, that's what we can see in this making of. The making of a phonoscene is the really first, as far as I know, the really first making of a film. And what do we see? We see a woman directing the film with a precision on the rhythm, on the way the dancer has to behave, and acting is important for her. So it's very interesting, and it shows that it was not easy at all to film a phonoscene. 90 to 100 films phonoscene made by Alice Guy, that's a lot. And it's but we have to say that Gaumont produced probably around 800 phonoscenes between 1905 or maybe a little bit before, but probably 1905 to 1915. There is no phonoscene film after 1915, and the phonoscene were shown in many places in France. Sometimes on the fairgrounds, but after 1907, and especially after 1910, 1912, big venues like the Gaumont Palace, the biggest film theater in the world at that time, there were 5,000, sometimes 5,500 people in the Gaumont Palace that were able to see and hear at the same time, thanks to the chronomegaphone that you presented, the phonoscene. So it means that it worked, it was powerful enough with the compressed air to give sound for big audiences like 5,000 people in the same movie theater. So it worked, and that's very important, the fact that Alice Guy made this kind of films, sound films, because we always speak about the silent period, and we forget that it's not only after the Vitaphone and the Warner Brothers that sound was coming. It was already there. There were millions of people that have seen sound films during the silent period. In France, the phonoscenes were shown in movie theaters in the middle of 2 or 3 hours programs. There were silent movies, mostly, but 2, 3, 4 phonoscenes or film parlant, where the talking movies were shown during the same program. So it was like le clou du programme, the best moment of the program, that were in the middle of it. And at that moment, the orchestra stopped, and we could hear and see the phonoscene. So she's part of something important at that time that is not experimental. Many times people in the history of film say sound was experimented before the end of the 1920s, and Vitaphone and RCA photo and Fox movie tone. That's not true. It was commercially good enough so that hundreds and thousands of film theaters were showing phonoscenes, and not only phonoscenes, but many other systems were proposed to the audiences at that time. When in my book about music, sound, and films during the silent period, I found, for this research, I found in any newspapers in any city in France examples of films that were shown with synchronized sound. So that moment is a moment of a variety of sounds, many kinds of different sounds, phonoscenes with synchronized sounds, many other systems with synchronized sounds. Pathé, that is unfamous for that, but it was true that they had a synchronized system also, not so good as the Gaumont one, but still they were showing it too. And at the same time, you could have a theater showing phonoscenes and other systems, an orchestra, singers, women singers, and men also sometimes were singing in the film theaters to accompany a film live during the moments. So each time it's a performance. Each film was shown in a different way in a different theater, and it's very difficult to say the film was this way and shown with a little orchestra. No, sometimes you have complete silence, and many times you have an orchestra with 2 musicians, sometimes 10 musicians. In the Gaumont Theater, there were 50 musicians and 60 people singing at the same time. So it's changing from one place to another completely. And also something else that we have to remember is that when you were presenting Wafa and Céline, I was thinking, can we say that the phonoscenes were able to be here in the different movie theaters because of the noise of the people, because of the noises that you could have outside of the movie theater, because they need to have electricity. Electricity was not good enough, in powerful enough in many cities, so they need to have a locomobile, I don't know how to, and it was like a train, like a locomotive from a train, but next to the fairground movie theater. And that means it was very noisy. It was so this was giving the electricity to have the projector projecting and to have the phonograph giving the sound, but with so much noise all over. And I found an article saying that the director of a fairground movie theater was asking the people to be silent at the beginning of the synchronized sound film, because if not, the projectionist was not able to fix the moment when the sound was beginning and the film has to be projected, and it was desynchronized. So it means that it was so noisy because of the audience that it was sometimes impossible to have good synchronization. And you can imagine that also films were projected in bars, restaurants, circus, many different kind of places where you have many noises. You have people shouting, speaking to each other, and sometimes looking at the screen. So in this very noisy environment, there is this specific moment of synchronized sound for film, but many times there were these noisy audiences, and before 1914, it's difficult to compare to what we know as film theater, where everybody is and coming to listen and be polite and stop speaking and so on. So it's very different environment that we have to imagine to understand really what it was to show a film in before 1914. So this is to give the context and just a few elements. What did I?
Martin, would
Yes?
it be a good time to maybe move to our discussion? We only have, I'm trying to be mindful of the time. We only have,
okay.
We can go 5 minutes over, but I don't want to interrupt you if there's something else you want to say now.
Yeah, just Yvette Gilbert. She's a very important singer, woman singing and creating a new style of songs in the moment of the way of singing, and very dramatic way, like if she was being on a stage with in a theater play. And she's famous for that. And she was also filmed, not by Gaumont, I think. I don't know the entire catalogs, but I think she was filmed by other people, and with synchronized sound. And that's interesting because she's one of the women singing at that time that were filmed at the same time for synchronized sound. But you're right, many times there were men singers like Dranem, Paulin, Mayol, Charlus. All of them were very famous at that time, and they were selling a lot of records, and they were famous because they were touring all over France, and they have this phonocene also making publicity for them. So it's like synergy of medias, different kind of medias you have at the same time. So already before radio and the synergy of media that we will have at the end of the 1920s, we already have this kind of opportunity to have publicity with phonocenes, records, newspapers, and on stage people. But yes, let's go on with the questions, and maybe I can add some things if there are some questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much to all three of you for such a rich, wonderful presentation, such interesting comments. Intermediality was definitely something on our mind that we wanted to discuss in this panel. Yeah, I mean, this is such a little known aspect, I think, still of Alice Guy's early career. And I think scholarship on early sound cinema often focuses on technological inventions and their inventors. And in Alice Guy's scholarship, more particularly, Léon Gaumont is often described in relation to the sound technologies developed by the Gaumont company, whereas Alice Guy's contributions to early sound cinema have to do with her creativity and inventiveness, right? But even then, it seems like Alice Guy's sound films are still somewhat understudied compared to the rest of her early Gaumont production. But I think, your presentation already, I think, begins to connect the two, right, Céline and Wafa, with the technology on the one side, the Gaumont technology and Alice Guy's films. And I think it was really inviting us to think further about Alice Guy's sound film production, which is such a rich avenue for future research. So this was really great. Tami, would you like to maybe go to one of the later questions we had prepared?
Yes, I just want to say this is really fantastic hearing about all of the archival information. I mean, I've spent years in the archives and still I never knew any of this, and it's just really incredible and wonderful. So thank you for sharing all of that information with us, and also Martin for the context and those precisions. My first question, or our first question, has to do with, and we have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion, but something about, is there something about the incorporation of sound, voice, music, and image that opens up a space for Alice Guy at the Gaumont Company? I think you've talked about it a little bit, but I wonder why Léon Gaumont might have put Alice Guy in charge of the phonoscène instead of the historical films she wanted to make, for instance. So it's not just, why Alice, but why phonoscène? And the other question is, we know, as we've learned, this was a period of what Laurent Guido calls spontaneous intermediality, or one in which many of the arts were working together, but it was also a time of rapidly changing gender roles in France, the women's progress movement, the marches in 1905 in Paris, and this battle between the traditional and the modern woman. La Française, we're fighting for them both, the women's journal at the time. The question I want to ask, inspired by this intermediality and also by Martin, your work on sound and reception, is how can a study of sounds of the theater, or attention to exhibition, reception, and spectatorship, or rather audio viewership, as Michel Chion calls it, add to our understanding of Alice Guy's early films and phonoscène? What can that attention to that audio, that space as a sound cinema space with these phonoscène and music and dance, what can this also tell us about how the new women, or the modern women, went to moviegoers, went to the cinema, and how can it help us to understand or think about what audiences Alice might have been making her films for? They're kind of, maybe some of them difficult questions and maybe not answerable, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes, Céline.
Maybe I will answer one part, but I'm sure that Wafa and Martin will completely complete the other parts. So one part that we didn't insist enough on is that Alice Guy was actually, as you mentioned, also was powerful at the Société Gaumont. Mostly when the studio was built, she was the creative director in some ways, the real producer there. She was the one also hiring with Feuillade, one of the greatest director of Gaumont. She hired Louis Eka. So she was also making her own choice for the artist direction inside the studio. So in some ways, the power that she had was maybe disturbing quite a bit some people that wanted also power in the Studio Gaumont that was being built in 1905, which was a huge city by itself. So we think so, and because also in her letters to Louis, she said that she had a bad work relation with René Decaux. We think that René Decaux was the one pushing her to Spain in 1905 to do this trip that she didn't like at all. It was a horrible trip. She was writing to her mother saying that it was not working at all. The phonoscène system was not working because it was too complicated to make it work with the real dancers of Spain. So this first trip was strange, even if she made beautiful documentaries there. Then when she came back, yes, she had to go on this production. On this case, I'm not really a specialist on why she was the one also producing so much phonosense, but since Gaumont really wanted to sell his prototype and to make it a standard, everybody had to join and help on the phonosense, I suppose, but maybe my answer is very general. Regarding also the connection with feminism, we have to say that, and maybe Wafa will also talk about it after me, but even in the dance world, there was a real transition at the end of the 19th century, that it was becoming a feminine world, because before in Paris, even in Milan or St. Petersburg, but Paris had much more in 18th century men dancers, and men were even dressing like women for the ballet. So it's really the 19th century and the end that makes the ballet much more feminine. And maybe Wafa wants to add something about it.
No, just I wanted to add something about what you say about having to shoot, why Alice Guy shot this so many phonoscènes. Yes, indeed, Giannatti precised that every directors in Gaumont were entitled to shoot phonoscènes, like they had to shoot at least 2 a day, and there was this kind of nearly of industrial production. So you had to do that. About feminism and everything, I'm not completely sure, because when you read, for example, for the Mont Sisters, it's really interesting to see how they are shot, but also how they are represented in articles. So they can be in fashion magazine, but they are in a lot of newspaper related to the art, but most of the time for more or less, or it's critics about the way they dance, or they're always admired, or about gossips. There are a lot of little gossips about them and about the relationship between the dancers and everything. I'm not completely sure, but it is kind of interesting to see how these women were quite important in this kind of gossip line. It's not about the love story. I couldn't find anything, but it's more about little stories in the dance world or things like that. I don't know about spectatorship. Maybe Martin has more answer about the influence of film parlant and spectatorships and everything.
Yeah, and I will answer also. There were questions about the talking film parlant. Film parlant were only little plays. There were like theater plays, very short, and also like fun sketches on stage. And there were direct recording of the artist, and that means that usually they were not with music. It was just the voices of the artist. On the contrary, phonoscène, they were like lip sync of a song, or sometimes as presented by Wafa and Céline, the dancers with the music. So that's the big difference between two. Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that Tami asked us about moviegoers, and women moviegoers were, especially in big cities like Paris, they were more and more during the 1900s to 1914, more and more young women workers in the textile factories, for instance, and they were before being married, they have money and they can go and spend their money in movie theaters. So there is this beginning of a modern woman with more independence at that time. And Alice Guy, she is one of these women that are independent, that are earning their lives, and she lives with no man for a long time because she married late. So at that time, she knew exactly what it means for a young woman to go and look for movies. So she knows what is a moviegoer, a woman moviegoer watching movies in a film theater, and that's maybe why also you can understand Consequences of Feminism's 1906 film that is incredibly interesting and speaking about feminisms. That is also why you have a phonocene that is called La Polka des Trottins. It's very interesting because Mayol is, who was a gay singer, is speaking to young women, independent women called trottins, petit trottins. That means they were like walking quickly on the streets of Paris. And he said, beware of old men. And the film, the phonocene is very interesting. When you listen carefully to what he's singing, it's about rape. It's about danger of men harassing women in the street. And so Alice Guy directed that one. And I mean, there is this context of a woman knowing what is to be an independent woman at that time. And that's probably one clue to understand.
Thank you so much, Martin. And Aurore, there were some wonderful questions in the Q&A about theater and relation to sound. Did this attract more theater? But maybe we can think about this and answer it after the second part of the panel. Aurore, do you want to say a few words, and then we'll hand it over. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all, very much to join us. I mean, I know also it's a little bit later in France, so thank you for taking the time to be with us. And I want to invite you all to stay for the second part of the panel about Alice Guy's career in the United States, so after 1907, which will be co-chaired by Kim Tamajoglu and Clara Auclair. So thank you so much. Merci à tous.
Thank you very much.
Mille merci. Thank you. Merci, Martin.
You're welcome. That was really nice.
Au revoir, à bientôt.
Merci, Jane.
Merci beaucoup.
I tried to answer the questions in the chat, okay?
Au revoir.
Can you hear us?
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you, Kim.
Unmute. Now you should be able to hear me.
We're all there.
Now I have to be able to get back to my slideshow.
Richard, we're live, so we're going to just go right ahead.
Let me
just
say and remind everyone that it was sound that brought Alice Guy to the United States in 1907, when after she married Herbert Blanchet, who was asked by Lyon Gaumont to market the chronophone in Cleveland, Ohio, and that they spent 9 months in the year from spring on, according to Alison McMahon's book, trying to market the chronophone. And then they went to Flushing, where Gaumont had his factory. But in any event, I'm Kim Tamajoglu, and I'm your host for part 2 of the workshop, Alice's French-American Connection, as we continue to explore her transatlantic career trajectory. In this part of the program, we are going to explore the broader context of Fort Lee, New Jersey, where the Blachets opened the American motion picture studio company Solax from 1910 to 1914. Our guest speakers today are Richard Kosowski, Professor Emeritus of Rutgers University and a historian at the Barrymore Film Center in Fort Lee, New Jersey. As an aside, Richard will speak a little bit about the new Barrymore Center at the end of his presentation. It will be a host site for the Women in the Silent Screen number 11 next year in June. Richard will be followed by Clara Auclair, PhD candidate at the University of Rochester and the University of Paris. She will discuss the collaborative relationship between Henri Menessier and Alice Guy, who worked together at Gaumont and at Fort Lee. Each speaker will have approximately 20 minutes to present, and then the 3 of us will engage in discussion. So without further ado, Richard, are you ready?
Yes, are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay, let me see. So I will go up here to share. Let's see, share the document. Is it being shared now?
Not yet.
You're not seeing it being shared now. Okay, well, what do you see? Are you seeing me?
We're seeing all three of us, so it should be able
You're
to.
not seeing my
you.
PowerPoint. Okay, so why not? Let me see.
Ben, a little assistance maybe?
Yes, if you go to the green share screen button at the bottom of the Zoom panel.
I'm looking at the Zoom panel. I'm not sure that I even see the Zoom panel. I
So,
see a share screen. There's a red share screen button at the top of mine.
so there should be, click on the share screen button and then
Yeah.
it should pull up your PowerPoint as an option to share.
Okay, to cloud, please save a couple, blah, blah, blah. Save to the cloud.
In any event, while Richard's figuring that out, I will say what a wonderful presentation the first sound panel was, and we thought it was really important to cover that context of sound in Alice's early career because we know very little about it. And I think after today, we see that the territory is very open to explore. There's a lot more to learn about sound in general and how the role it played in Alice Key's career, because I think it does have an impact on her films at Solax. I think that sound plays an integral part in these films. Got it yet, Richard?
Well, I'm doing what I can here, but we didn't have any time to deal with it.
We did not have any time to enter the Zoom, folks, so.
Yeah. So let's try this.
Well, or we could have Clara start. Clara, do we want to do that? Why don't you start, Clara?
I can do that if you want. What do you think, Richard?
I couldn't hear what you said. So I'm looking for view here, Zoom webinar.
It's what you're in if you just bring your mouse down to the bottom.
Yes.
It should say share screen. It should pop up.
The green share screen button.
Or you can close the PowerPoint, reopen the PowerPoint, and then hit share screen.
Yes.
And how did they
share it?
Phonosend? I feel like we have the synchronization issues today that we can really relate to. The
they had a little practice before us. They had a similar issue putting up the PowerPoint. So Richard, you should see it, just say where it says share screen at the bottom of your screen.
And the technical issues that Alice Guy had in 1905. Charmaine Dulac still had in 1930.
Listen to Ben.
See shared screen on mine.
If you go into the main Zoom call, when you can see all of our faces,
yes.
There should be at the bottom, very center, a button that says share screen. And it has a green arrow pointing upwards. And then there should be an option to share your PowerPoint that pulls up once you click on that.
Sorry, I had it before. I can't even find this anymore.
We can also move on to Clara.
Yeah, Richard, let's start with Clara so that you can, maybe Ben can close up the rest of us out. And Clara,
Ben, can you give me some help with this?
Yeah, Ben. And Clara, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation on Henri Menessier?
Sure. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep. It's
okay.
up, Clara.
So, you'll have the context after then. I was hoping Richard could give you a little bit more context on Fort Lee, but I'll try to be quick so we have still enough time to do everything we want to do. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm very excited to be talking about the sound presentation, because as Kim just said, the presence of Alice Guy Blaché in the United States is because of the chronophone, and there is still so much we don't know about the chronophone in the United States. And we really hope that we can pull something together to talk about this also in 2022. So the topic of my talk today is the collaboration between Alice Guy Blaché and French set designer Henri Ménessier, because they've both worked together in France and in the United States. In France for Gaumont, and in the United States, Henri Ménessier worked for Guy Blaché at Solax. And I also found their partnership interesting because they had a lot of respect for each other, and they considered themselves as very faithful collaborators. So they talk about each other in their memoirs, which doesn't happen often with people who have collaborated with Guy Blaché. So I will first introduce Henri Ménessier, and then look closely at some films they worked together on, so we can see the importance of set design in Guy Blaché's production, and thanks also to her collaboration with Ménessier. Oh, so now we are Richard.
Now we have Richard. Actually, Clara, let Richard go ahead possibly.
Yes, okay.
Is it up, Richard?
Not anymore.
Richard, hit it again. Sorry, folks.
Richard, you're on mute at the moment. Richard, your microphone is on mute at the moment.
You're on mute.
Here we go.
Yeah, you're on mute, Richard. Maybe this they're hitting some
Share your screen.
And then go to the share screen button.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, that's not on here. View.
We saw it.
button. They had it up.
I know I had it before and then it vanished. I'm working on a different machine.
Oh.
It keeps wanting to sort of hide this thing. So wait a minute, where are we?
If you move the mouse around, it'll pop up.
Yeah, I'm moving it. I don't want it there. So, okay, this is this. No, this is this. Right? This is more. Share screen. Share the screen.
Yay!
Excellent.
That's it?
We can see it.
Okay. Yes. Should I keep it like this or should I try to
full screen?
View mode. Go to click on view mode or the little icon on the bottom right corner with the arrow.
No.
Thank you, Tami.
Yes.
Yeah. Where it goes slideshow? You want to go to the
yes, slideshow.
Slideshow? All right.
Yes. Yay.
That's what you want.
Thank you.
Right.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, see, if we had 6 minutes beforehand, we would have saved them.
Let's go, Richard. Hit the show.
Good enough. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about Alice Guy Blaché and the French filmmaking community in Fort Lee, which means there are three things, and those three things are all sort of related. And when you're talking about the United States, the history of motion pictures begins with Thomas Edison in New Jersey. And this is Edison in his West Orange laboratory. Yes, he began doing the experiments with Dixon in West Orange, but he moved to New York City. He established a studio in New York City. It's very difficult to make early movies in New York City. It's quite crowded. It's dark. There are a lot of skyscrapers. So they would have to go outside to different areas in the north, south, east, and west to look for locations. Fort Lee, New Jersey happened to be an interesting location. It's a location that you wind up seeing in a film like Rescued from an Eagle's Nest. And Edison thinks they're going fairly well. They're developing the Motion Picture Patents Company. But the problem for Edison and the other American producers is that, in fact, by 1910, the major share of the American film market is controlled by the French, especially by the Pathé Company. In 1907, Pathé is releasing a film a day in the United States. There are no American producers who can compete with one film a day. So there's this flood, this invasion of films coming from France, especially from Pathé. And this winds up amping itself up by 1910 when Pathé builds this very large film factory, basically a laboratory to produce motion picture prints in Bound Brook, New Jersey, which is somewhat south. It's near New Brunswick, actually. And the following year opens a large studio, in Jersey City on Congress Street, where they're going to make American films. Now, as Richard Abel has explained, there is all sorts of pushback from the American producers. There's pushback against the French as industrial competition and also cultural pushback. So one reason to build this studio in the United States is so that Pathé can advertise itself as not only manufacturing the prints here and therefore saving import duties and tariffs, but actually being American. This is a piece of leader from a 1911 American Pathé film called A Close Call. And you see what they've put on here, in addition to the National Censorship Board info, is that the picture has not only been manufactured in America, made in America, but it has been enacted in America. That is, they can sell this movie, A Close Call, not as another one of those Frenchy films, but as an American film. And Pathé and the other French companies are looking to maintain their hold on the American market by trying to make their films American. So although Pathé is established in Jersey City, it's a French company established in Jersey City, they're trying to Americanize their product as well as maintaining the French content. And of course, one of the best ways of making your film American is by having it made by a tribe of Red Indians. It's very difficult for anyone to compete with that or to criticize that film as not being an American film, despite the fact that it's a Pathé production. And we know that among the other American directors that were hired by Pathé, they had James Young Deere, who apparently now he's considered a pretend Indian, but Pathé still advertised him and his company as a tribe of Red Indians making some of Pathé's films for them in America, and largely, in fact, as with White Fawn's Devotion in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Now, can you see on the top of your screen, because it seems to have vanished on mine, a little X where Fort Lee, New Jersey exists? You can sort of see that. Okay, so here's a map of Manhattan. Everybody sees Manhattan. Fort Lee, New Jersey is up on the top. It would appear to be very close, right? Now, you were asking me earlier the question, Kim, well, why did they go to Fort Lee, New Jersey? Well, they're too jammed up in Manhattan. They have to go somewhere. They can go east into Brooklyn or Queens or Long Island. Long Island is flat. There are no mountains in Long Island. There are no rivers in Long Island. There's the ocean, but that's about it. You can go north. That's about as developed as the rest of Manhattan or the Bronx. And in fact, Edison and the Biograph Company do build studios north of Manhattan in the Bronx. If you go to the west, the area right across the Hudson River is very heavily developed, like Hoboken. But if you go up a little bit farther north, you wind up seeing this geological element of the Palisades, which are huge granite cliffs, at times 300 feet high. Now, during the American Revolution, the top of these Palisades, as they were called, seemed to be a nice, safe spot where you could build a fort. And that's why George Washington establishes this Fort Lee on top of the Palisades, because he thinks the British are not going to be able to climb the Palisades. Well, what happens is the British sail up the Hudson a little bit, they climb up at an easier spot, and they march down, and therefore force George Washington to retreat from the fort. But while the Palisades may not have been so successful as a military obstacle, they were a commercial obstacle. And they were a commercial obstacle. That is, nobody really lived there except some truck farmers, and a few people operating what we might call bed and breakfasts for day tripping tourists. That ends at the end of the 19th century when a streetcar line is built up into Fort Lee. So at the end of the streetcar line, as usually happened in the United States, is an amusement park. The amusement park is built so that streetcar will have some place to send its customers on weekends. And as you see, the Palisades Amusement Park on top of this giant cliff is advertised as 40 acres across from Broadway, in sight of Broadway. In other words, if it's that close for tourists and vacationers, it's also close to actors and anybody else who's coming out of Broadway. I show you this photo on the left to indicate that who was running that company, the Skank brothers, Joe and Nick. And of course, later they have another role to play in motion pictures, but they start here in Palisades Park. By 1907, many film companies are regularly going to Fort Lee. And in fact, Paul Spiers did research 30 years ago indicating that sometimes several companies would be fighting to use the same location. Now, clearly these Palisades, are a great sort of center of geological attraction, but they weren't the only element of Fort Lee that were utilized. Certainly we think of Pearl White in House of Hate, as you see here, or in The Perils of Pauline, pioneering this genre of cliffhanger. I mean, literally hanging off these cliffs. But if you went a little bit inside, sort of towards the land from these cliffs, you find a village that is in some instances frozen in time. Those high cliffs did not keep out the British Army, but they kept out a lot of the industrialization and civilization that had affected the areas a little bit south of them in New Jersey. So Rambo's Hotel, Rambo's Tavern, which is not far from the site of Cliffhanger Point, becomes one of several sort of 19th century Victorian era of roadhouses, B&Bs that are a host to filmmakers visiting who want to do something else other than film the heroine, hanging off the Palisades. So that part of Fort Lee, is known as Coatesville, was the northern end of Fort Lee. If you went to the downtown section of Fort Lee, which is basically one street, you would find, among other things, a single 4-story tenement structure, which you see in the background here in the curtain pole. This 4-story tenement structure became a favorite of filmmakers like Griffith, D.W. Griffith. So that building, which is surrounded by nothing, there's only one 4-story tenement building in Fort Lee, that becomes the centerpiece of the Musketeers of Pig Alley, the New York Hat, the Italian Barber, and the Court of Life. And I recently was able to get this wonderful enlargement from the restoration of the Court of Life, a new print of the Court of Life. And you'll see that the storefront in the bottom of that tenement at that time is occupied by a French-American restaurant, French-American bakery with baguettes in the window. So there's already some kind of French community, however small, in Fort Lee in 1909, even before the first permanent studios are built there. First permanent studio, the Champion Studio, was built just on the northern edge of Fort Lee in 1910. It's a kind of a small independent studio, but from our point of view, the most important contribution is that of Eclair. And in February of 1911, the Eclair Company announces that they are going to build a laboratory and studio in downtown Fort Lee. In other words, they're going to do what Pathé was doing elsewhere in New Jersey, in Bound Brook and in Jersey City. Now, there's the question of who is paying for this tremendous explosion of film studio construction in New York. In New Jersey. And I think one of the people you need to look at is Jules Brulatour. And Jules Brulatour was an agent. He was a middleman. He sold not only Lumiere's film stock to filmmakers, but he also became the exclusive agent for George Eastman's film stock. So in other words, every piece of film stock in the United States went through Brûlatour's fingers. He became very wealthy, very powerful, and he wanted to be something other than a middleman. So you find Brûlatour investing in studios and different kind of laboratories, even making films himself, especially if they could promote his protege, who you see in the picture here, Hope Hampton. Now, Brûlatour is one of the investors behind the building of this Éclair studio. And Éclair built themselves a greenhouse studio, a glass greenhouse studio on their property, and also a laboratory. And in fact, in those days, the laboratory was really as important, or maybe even more important than the stage. Anybody could put up a stage. You could film on an open air stage, but the laboratory equipment was expensive and it needed specialists. So here you see the Éclair lab, which they particularly promoted in their advertising. And who's working there? Well, I think this is Lucien Andrieux. He's been sent over from France, but all the women are local. They live in Fort Lee. This became a job for men and women living in Fort Lee. They would perform various tasks on the films that were being made or processed there. The Éclair company was able to promote themselves. Here in the Éclair Bulletin, you see it's the Éclair Company of New York and Paris with their laboratories and studio in Fort Lee, New Jersey. So there's an American face. There's an American face on this bulletin of Gracie Scott. But behind the camera are more and more French technical people. And that especially begins to change in 1912. I mean, Éclair didn't seem to be completely satisfied with the films they were making here in 1911. So in 1912, they sent over Etienne Arnaud, who is what? Alice Blachet's old assistant, right? Alice Blachet's old assistant is sent to sort of take over creative control of Éclair's American operation, and he begins making more ambitious films like Robin Hood, for example. And the trade papers are constantly reminding us that he's going back and forth, and he's going back and forth to Paris. Why? Because he's bringing more technicians with him. Every time he comes back, he brings more technicians. This is a photo from October 1912. And 6 weeks later, he comes back, and there are articles. Ben Carré has arrived in America. A whole article about a new set designer coming over from Paris to the United States. Now, I'd like you to see this because you see Charles Georgeon here. And Georgeon, who was running the Éclair operation, was very interested in expanding into America. Georgeon is often seen in New Jersey, and he is not only interested in building up the Éclair operation, but he winds up promoting the World Peerless Studio as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here are some of the people. This is a Mark Wanamaker photo that were brought over by Éclair: Georges Benoit, Ben Carré, and Lucien Andrieux. And suddenly the number of French filmmakers in Fort Lee by 1912 certainly are beginning to increase. And they're increasing so much that they are forming themselves into their own community. Now, here again, you see Benoit and Andrieux in the backseat of Francis Doublier's automobile. Francis Doublier, one of the original Lumiere cameraman, is in the United States. After 1905, he is building and installing film laboratories. And when the film laboratories are being built and installed in Fort Lee, it's Doublier who is brought in to help do that. I don't know, did Brûlatour, bring him in? I'm not sure why Doublier got this job. I like this photo, and I'm not sure you can see it on your screen, but they are off on a visit to the Villa Richard. And the Villa Richard was a big French restaurant in Fort Lee. It was started by a chef named Jean Richard, who had worked at Delmonico's. And so this was a big upscale place. And so all these Frenchmen are going off to eat at the French restaurant, but of course they're flying American flags and making very sure that they're flying American flags on their outing. Bringing up Francis Doublier allows me to show you this photograph. This is a famous photo of Alice, and on the back of the original print, which I think Tony Slide has, she writes that she's in front of her house. She says, "This is my house." In Fort Lee, this building was later known as the Doublier House because Francis Doublier later owned this house and lived in it until his death in the late 1940s. So there's this other connection here where Doublier and Alice Blanchet actually living in the same home. Now, why is Alice Blanchet here? Because we talked earlier about how she's in the United States and she's working in Flushing. She has the Solac studio in Flushing. She's moving out of Flushing, and she decides to take her Solac studio from Flushing and rebuild it here in Fort Lee. Now, on the top of this full page ad, you know, what did they say? What's the most important thing to brag about? Fort Lee is the home of Rising Sun Films. It's later on, you can imagine somebody saying, "Hey, big news, we've moved to Hollywood," you know, but instead they're saying we've moved to Fort Lee. That's the most important piece of advertising here. And this ad appears in Moving Picture World on August the 15th, 1912. But we know that they were already making films in Fort Lee. Two Little Rangers, which we saw in the Kennington program, was released before August 15th. But if you look at Fort Lee, if you look at the Two Little Rangers, you see there's only one interior in that movie. And that interior looks to me as if it's done on an open air stage. So while they're building themselves a new studio, you know, they're quite happy filming on the streets or filming elsewhere until that studio is ready for them. And that's a very big studio. Now, I showed you a picture of the Champion, which was modest, and the Eclair studio, which was not especially large. This is a very large studio. It's also what you call in the East a vertical studio. So that while with the Eclair, you had the stage was in this building and the laboratory was in that building, which is the kind of studio that would be built in Hollywood, where the writer's building is here, the camera building is here, the executives. More typical of the East were these vertical studios where everything was in one building. So Alice has her executive offices, her shooting stage, and her laboratory in this building that's going up in 1912. That's pretty big. So the question is, where did the money come from to do this? Where did the money come from to do this? I did a search of real estate records to see like who owned this property. And it traced me back to something called the New Jersey Studio Company. And the New Jersey Studio Company is incorporated on November 8th, 1911. So that's a few months after Eclair opens. And within 2 weeks of incorporating on November 8th, the New Jersey Studio Company starts buying land, and they begin buying land in 1911. They buy more land in 1913, 1915. So they're increasing this purchase. And who is this New Jersey Studio Company? Well, the New Jersey Studio Company, the president is Herbert Blanchet. This is a document from a mortgage that the New Jersey Studio Company is taking out in 1915. And Alice signs as the secretary, and she attests that Herbert Blanchet is the president of New Jersey Studio Company, right? Now, Alice, as she signs on this document, is the president of the Solax Company. So this is something we have to keep in mind. Alice is president of the filmmaking company. Herbert is president of the company that owns the land and the buildings. Right? Now, I don't know how control of the New Jersey Studio Company was divided. That still requires a little more research. So they're opening this building, and the building has its own lab in it. I hope you can see all of this. It says, basically, this is a help wanted female ad that Alice Blanchet puts into the moving picture world. Wanted a young woman who must be intelligent and competent and thoroughly understands both negative and positive cutting. It's nice for a few things. First of all, she's, it's that gendered occupation, but whoever wrote this ad assumes that there are enough women living in the Fort Lee area who already have experience cutting films that you could just paste an ad like that, and there will be a bunch of resumes, on your desk very quickly. This ad was placed only a few months after that studio building opened. A year after that, Alice and Herbert decide to build another large building, a large laboratory building in December 1913. So they have not only the small original lab in the main studio building, a new lab building, which will work on prints not only for themselves, but for other filmmakers. And to the right, that strange structure on the right is an open air stage. Because even in Fort Lee, even when you had a enclosed stage, many of the filmmakers would still prefer to work for various reasons on an open air stage. Well, here by 1917, the Blachets promoting themselves as a team, and they're making feature films. But what they're promoting by 1917 is no longer Solex, but it's this U.S. Amusement Corporation, and I believe that is also an entity that Herbert Blanchet was the president of. So without spending too much time, there may be some reason to see a bit of problem here. Now, this, in case you can't read all of this clearly on your screens, you can see a better copy in my book, Fort Lee, the Film Town. This is from the 1915 New Jersey State Census. And about halfway down here, you see, or a third of the way down, you see the Blanchet family living on Palisade Avenue, which means that they've moved from that original house that Dublier is now living in. And it says Herbert Blanchet, you go across, where was he born and what's his occupation? And on the right, it says motion picture. And underneath it, it says, okay, Alice Blanchet, born in France, blah, blah, occupation, it says housewife. And they're living, and the motion picture man and his housewife spouse are living with their 2 children and 2 servants in this house on Palisade Avenue. But 1915, she's still the president of this company. I don't know why there is this error, because on other pages of that census, there are women who have the occupation of being in the motion picture business. But it depended who answered the door when the census taker knocked for the information. By 1918, the U.S. Amusement Corporation is winding down, and Alice makes her last film in her own studio, in the Lemoyne Avenue studio, Bessie Love in The Great Adventure for Pathé. 1919 is one of the fires. There are lots of fires in Fort Lee. And this fire in 1919 did not destroy the studio building, but it burned the laboratory. And I show you this because I like on the bottom, the local newspaper, it talks about Stella Whippet, the negative cutter, who is working on films for 6 different directors and has gathered up all the continuities and negatives. So she not only saved the film negatives, but she saved the paperwork. She saved the paperwork. Alice was not working at her studio in 1919, December 1919. It was Capellani. It was Albert Capellani who was shooting on the stage, which was not involved in this fire that year. Now, there's some difference of opinion. Some of the news accounts say that Capellani was not there at the time of the fire. Other accounts say Capellani helped fight the fire. I don't know, but it was Capellani and his employer, Louis Selznick, who had been leasing the studio from the Blachets at that period. Capellani is one of many other French filmmakers who are imported for the Peerless World feature film studio. Peerless was an idea, a notion of Charles Georgeon. And Georgeon, in addition to simply making short films for release in the United States by Eclair, wanted as a personal project to make features. So he got backing from Jules Brulatour. He also made arrangements with the Schuberts, the big theatrical dynasty, and he starts importing filmmakers. And he imports Capellani, Emile Chautard, he imports Maurice Tourneur. But just at the moment when, you know, Eclair and Georgeon are going to make this leap into the production of features, the war starts and you know, history develops in another direction. Now, of course, most of those French filmmakers stay in the United States. Albert Capellani, certainly Maurice Tourneur. Capellani, we know where he lived. His house still exists in Fort Lee. And he lived in the south end of Fort Lee, near the second home of Alice and Herbert Blanchet. And of course, there are many of these photographs showing the Capellani family and the Alice Blanchet and her family spending time together. Again, another extension of this community, which was not just a professional community, but also a friendly community. I love this thing. This is the Emile Cole map. This is a map that was printed in the late 1920s in New Jersey. It was showing the roads that were going to feed into the George Washington Bridge. What would be the George Washington Bridge? And so Emile Cole, from memory, and remember he left in 1914 or 15, he starts writing down the important French landmarks in Fort Lee. So he's talking about, he has this Solac studio and the Eclair studio, but it's also, Chez Georges Benoit is here, Doublier's house is over there, the Villa Richard is up, by the river. His own home, he wasn't able to put in his own home because the access roads for the George Washington Bridge went right over Hoyt Street, so Hoyt Street no longer exists. But Emile Cole, in his mind, sort of thinks that the Fort Lee is this French community with him and Benoit and Francis Doublier, all sort of spending time together. Doublier, again, is the glue, I think, that holds this community together. I mean, there are many photographs of Doublier visiting people, right? We found the Doublier visiting Emile Laust. Clara was able to show me some film of this. Here's Doublier visiting Emile Cole at his home. And even years later, here is Charles Pathé visiting Doublier at his home. And we know that Doublier saw himself as a historian too. And so he wanted to promote his story, his part in the beginning of the Lumiere operation, his part in the beginning of motion picture film industry in the United States. And one of the ways he did that was by collecting equipment. And a lot of his equipment, of course, wound up in the George Eastman Museum in Rochester. Now, I show you this. This is a fragment of the tax rolls for the borough of Fort Lee in 1916. Now, most of the real estate tax income in Fort Lee in 1916 came from taxing movie studios. And you see on the top, the Peerless Studio, Motion Picture Property Company, which is Eclair, the Willett Studio, Triangle, New York Motion Picture Company, Universal had just built a studio, Paragon and Solax. And, there's actually more pages of this document that have other studios. It's a big part of the economy. If you have a job in Fort Lee, you're probably working one way or another in the movie business. One of the things that you see on the bottom of that list, and that Emile Cole did not write down because it post-dated his period in Fort Lee, was the Paragon Studio, a very large studio that was built as, again, a private project of Jules Brulatour and his partner, Maurice Tourneur. So Brulatour basically, hires Maurice Tourneur away from the world, and Brulatour and Tourneur set themselves up at this giant Peerless Paragon Studio, which they promote in this wonderful film, A Girl's Folly, which is a whole movie designed to show off the new movie studio that they have built for themselves. But it's at that studio, sometimes for Paragon Films and then later for Paramount, that Tourneur makes so many of his most important American films, including The Bluebird, Prunella, and this film, which as far as I know is not around anymore, Barbary Sheep. And Barbary Sheep is a Paramount feature from 1917. It takes place in Paris and in North Africa. And so Paris and North Africa had to be rebuilt by Ben Carré. And I like this photograph. This photograph came out of a local family scrapbook. And this is like a tourist photo, as if you had gone to Universal City or something. And on the top, it says, when we were in, quote, France. And it says movie scenery, Fort Lee, 1917. This is one of the Parisian streetcars that Ben Carré had designed and built for Tourneur's production of Barbary Sheep. So, you know, these studios were fairly open. You know, you could walk onto them. You know, they would have actually been happy to have you if you wanted to serve as an extra. The last, but of course, after Tourneur leaves in 1919, end of World War I tends to shut down a lot of production in the East and in Fort Lee, and there are only a few independent outfits. And the last French company, maybe the last silent company operating in Fort Lee, was the Henri Diamant Film Company, which was designed to make films for Hope Hampton, who was the mistress of, guess who? Jules Brulatour, right? So there's Jules Brulatour is also in at the end, making a movie called The Unfair Sex. The Unfair Sex with Hope Hampton at the Paragon Studio. Now, we talked about the 1919 fire, which burned the laboratory of Solex. That laboratory was rebuilt. It was too valuable. They rebuilt that. But in 1929, the studio that had been abandoned itself also burned down. And it says here in this article, well, it wasn't used as a studio anymore. It was basically used as a warehouse. They had furniture in there. They had sets and paints. So what remained on the property were the film vaults and lab spaces that had been built by the New Jersey Motion Picture Company. In the 1930s, it was owned by Consolidated Film Labs. And in the 1960s, it was bonded film storage. This is where Museum of Modern Art would have stored some of their films. Of course, there were many other film storage facilities in Fort Lee as well. And today, the site of the Solex studio and the laboratory, by the 21st century, it's the parking lot of a supermarket. In the parking lot of a supermarket here, and you would say, well, maybe that's the last trace of Alice in New Jersey, except Alice returned to New Jersey and she's buried in New Jersey, and Alice is buried in Mahwah, and at least there her marker, you know, does memorialize her as the first female director and the president of the Solex company in Fort Lee. Now, if you go to the site of the parking lot today, you will see one of several historic markers that the Fort Lee Film Commission put up. And this gives you a little background information about Solex. But in the background, there's a skyscraper, this high rise. And this is part of a new development in Fort Lee. And I point that out to you because at the foot of the high rise has been built the Barrymore Film Center. And this is a picture of the still uncompleted Barrymore Film Center, which will be open in October of this year, and to which we hope to see all of you next year for the 2022 edition of this, which will take place hopefully in our wonderful new 260-seat state-of-the-art theater. And I will leave it at that because I know we're running late and I already spent half my time fiddling with the PowerPoint. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Claire, are you ready to go?
Well, I got the stop share. I'll get stop share off there. Stop share one. Okay.
Take it away, Clara. And we'll have a little bit of time. We can go a little past 2.
Okay, we have, how much time do I have?
Just go with it.
Okay, so I already did my introduction. Thank you so much, Richard. So many questions your presentation is bringing, and to contextualize the presence of the Blanchet in the United States. So I already said I was going to talk about set design in Guy Blanchet's production, looking in particularly at the collaboration between Henri Ménessier and Alice Guy Blanchet. But as a forward to contextualize a little bit this talk with Wafa's and Céline's intervention earlier today and Richard's, I want to open with some unanswered questions about the Gaumont presence in the United States and about the development of the chronophone in the United States. So the person who's worked the most on this is Alison McMahon, and she has a very good account of the presence of, or at least the history of the failure of the chronophone in the United States. But some sources say that Gaumont was not interested in producing American films like Pathé and Éclairs when they set up to Fort Lee to do American subjects. According to some to other sources, Gaumont was not interested to do that. He only wanted to do French films. However, he was producing American subjects for the chronophones. So there is still so much research to do to uncover this context. I just want to open with those questions here, because according to advertisement found in the trade press, they did produce American subjects for the chronophone to develop their technology in the United States. My question is, when and where did they produce those American subjects? Were they produced in the UK, in their Gaumont London plant, or when did Flushing start producing those films? Because you can see in the papers in 1908 and 1909, they were advertising American subjects, the Lincoln speech at Gettysburg that you can see on the right here. So another interesting document that is in the Cinémathèque Française collection that Wafa and Céline mentioned earlier there is very little information about the Flushing plant in the Cinémathèque Française Louis Gaumont archive, but there are those Flushing laboratory production report from the 1914 showing that Flushing was producing prints for the US, for other companies. We have Éclair, Méliès, and Gaumont here, and Reliance. So there's still so much to discover about the role of this factory in Flushing. And what is extremely interesting to me is to know who was operating this plant, because, and Richard talked about it and says those women, there were a French technician in Éclair, but those women were American. Well, I'm not so sure that those women, the women working in the laboratory of the French plants, were American. There are 2 independent researchers that are doing a lot of research on the Pathé workers, Patrice and Chantal Laforie, who are seeing in the records that actually a lot of French women laboratory workers were sent to the US for Pathé. Is it the same for Gaumont? According to the memoirs of Henri Ménessier, there are a lot of Gaumont laboratory workers in Flushing. So I think this is also a very interesting, but that trajectories of those workers is very difficult to trace. And the history of studio workers in the early days of cinema is still to be explored. So without a transition, but the transition being that it is thanks to Ménessier that I have this little snippet of information that he was, when he came to the US, he went to talk to Gaumont laboratory workers in 1910. But to introduce a little bit Henri Ménessier to those who don't know him, so Henri Ménessier was a French set designer, and his collaboration with Guy Blanchet gave us glimpses to better understand Flushing, and the beginning of the Solax productions. And paying a closer attention to set design in Guy Blachet's production also allow us to better understand her narrative techniques and preferred film language, because set design was extremely important in her films. The career of Ménessier is mostly associated with 3 directors for whom he constituted a very precious collaborator. It was Alice Guy Blachet, Albert Capellani, and Léon Spiers. They all have the peculiarity of having worked for Gaumont and having a career in the United States, in both starting in Fort Lee and then in Los Angeles. If we find Ménessier's name often cited alongside them, praising the sophistication and accuracy of his sets, his career remains little known outside of Jean-Pierre Berthomet's research on early set designers in France. One of the reasons for this is because we don't have a lot of archive about him. He didn't kept a personal archive that I know of to begin with. And the only thing we know about him are interviews he gave for the Commission de Recherche Historique for the Cinémathèque Française, which was an initiative started in the 1940s by Musidora, Henri Langlois, Jean Métry, and Georges Sadoul, like oral history of recording of early pioneers of the motion picture. And he was very active in those interviews. He participated to 9 of them. And in those interviews, he talks a lot about Alice Guy Blachet, which is, to me, extremely interesting because a lot of her collaborators often don't mention her. For example, Francis Doublier, I work a lot on Francis Doublier too, and he doesn't mention her a lot, whereas he did work with her at the Solax studio too. But Ménessier and Blachet had a very close relationship. Another thing that is very interesting about Henri Ménessier, and that links a little bit with the intermediality that Céline, Martin, and Wafa were talking about earlier, is that in those interviews, we understand that his career went from the theater to the films. It was very fluid, and he would work for the theater and cinema at the same time. This is a poster from 1890 that mentions Ménessier, but not Henri Ménessier, his uncle, who was a very famous theater set designer in Paris. So Henri Ménessier was trained by his uncle and started with the theater, but apparently was more interested in working for film. I'm not gonna tease out everything we find in these interviews because I would really like to look at some of the films, but some points that I found really interesting that we learn in those interviews, and here I just reproduced a transcript and translated a part of it, is that he always found work networking. And I think that's very important too, to understand the French film network in Fort Lee, is that they all kind of knew each other and kind of employed each other. And another interesting aspect that Ménessier talked about is that set designers signed exclusivity contract to work with some studios. For example, Ménessier at the beginning of his career started for both Pathé and Gaumont, and after he worked for Gaumont, he had to sign a contract that he would never work for Pathé. So when he tried his chance in the United States, he was not allowed to look for work at Pathé. Ménessier here in this little interview said that he was wanting to go to the United States because everybody was talking about the United States in the 1910s, that apparently Pathé and Gaumont wanted to set up industries, factories there. And the way he was able to travel is he was able to get a theater contract to work in New York, and then to go find Alice Guy Blachet in Fort Lee. And that's where he talks about the Gaumont workers. So I invite you to read yourself those interviews, because we learn a lot about this early career, and they're all available on the Cinémathèque Française website. Of course, they're all in French, but maybe that could be another great publication project. And he also talks a lot about Brûlatour and the importance of Brûlatour for Fort Lee and for the French film studios in Fort Lee. And another thing that to add to Richard's talk is that Jules Brûlatour was able to hire all those French people because he himself spoke French. He came from Louisiana, and that was key for him to be able to place people in those French studios and invest in those French studios. And even if there are few, there are very interesting anecdotes about set design at this time. Like Henri Ménessier spent 10 years in the United States in a very key period, in the transition period, as Charlie Kiel calls it. And both in France, in the US, he recounts how the film space was envisioned. And he recounts two very interesting anecdotes where he said that film directors were asking him to move his set because they were not centered vis-a-vis the camera. So he had to move the set, but he was making fun of it because the cameraman didn't think about moving the camera to center the camera to the set. So it shows that the studio space was still very static and organized around the camera, not the camera moving through the set. I won't be able to talk about everything, but Henri Ménessier is, of course, behind Alice Guy, Naissance, Vie et Mort, behind the sets of La Naissance, la Vie et la Mort du Christ from Alice Guy Blaché. He also talks about the beginning of the Flushing studio and how key his presence might have been too, because when he arrived to go and get work with Alice Guy Blaché, to meet with Alice Guy Blaché, she first asked him, well, what are you doing here? And he says, I work for the theater, but what are you doing? And she answers, well, we're trying to set up this little company. Would you come work for me? But it was too expensive. So she was able to first hire him part-time. So he would work for the theater during the day and for the film at night, for the Solax at night for 3 months. And after Solax really took off, Alice Guy Blaché asked him to come full-time, and he said he was paid $50 a week, which was the most set designer was paid at the time. So it shows both the success that the Solax studio was able to get very quickly. And to answer to one of Richard's question, apparently the Blachés were able to get Solax because Gaumont bought back Alice Guy Blaché's shares of the Gaumont company. That's how she got some of the funds. That's according to Alison McMahon. But finally, I would say that both Guy Blaché and Henri Ménessier had a very acute understanding of film space, and that they closely worked together to compose dynamic spaces, allowing for narration to expand. For example, if there is one characteristic that we almost find in films, in the films where they work together, is that the creation of a second frame or a second space within the main film space. A window, a door, a chair, a wall, where in this second space, a second simultaneous action occurs, and which heightens the drama for the spectator. And this, I would like to show here the clever use of windows in two films, a Gaumont film and a Solac films. The Gaumont film is from 1907. So when I was doing more research on this, apparently Maurice Giannatti says that Etienne Arnaud would have directed this one, whereas it's often considered as the last film Alice Guy Blaché would have made in the US. In any case, it is a Ménessier set. And to me, it is very similar to other Guy Blaché films. And so in this film, Sur la barricade, that you can see in the Gaumont DVD set, it is during the French Commune in the 1870. And the first shot is extremely efficient. I'm going to show it. I'm muting it so you can, trying to mute the sound so I can talk over it. Yes. It is a very, very efficient first shot where you have this scene between the son and the mother at the table. And at the window on the left, you can see patrols of going in the street. And it says that insurrection is raging in the city, but people have to eat. And so the young boy is going to get some milk for the mother. The mother tries to beg him to not go, and he's going to go, and he's going to cross the picket line to go, and that's where the drama occurs. This is just a teaser. I won't show you the whole film, but this is also an example of the use of indoor and exterior set in Gaumont films and Guy Blachet's films in particular. This was probably shot right next door to the Gaumont studios, and it's also a very clever use of space. The use of the window to heighten the drama, where you see the patrols going in Sur la Barricade, is also used in another Guy Blachet film, Falling Leaves, the 1912 film, where the window here, where you can see Magda Foy, the little girl, is looking through the window at the leaves falling, because the drama of the film is that the doctor says that when the last leaf falls, the older sister will die of tuberculosis. And the whole drama is built with the suspense of seeing the leaf falling in the frame. I won't show the film here, but you have other example of when the little girl decides to then stop the leaves from falling and reattaching them to the tree. And another example of this creation of a second frame within the frame is with The Sewer, 1912, which is not directed by Gilles Blachet, but by Edward Warren, and the set design and script is by Henri Ménessier, is here where you have also Magda Foy here, who works for those crooks, and the crooks who have decided to rob a wealthy philanthropist, played by Darwin Carr, which is right here on the right. And Magda Foy is gonna save the philanthropist because he was very kind to her. And you see that Magda Foy, she's gonna preempt this action and this salvation, if you want, by showing Magda Foy on the right side of the frame, and she's hidden from the rest of the crew. And this double double framing of the scene is very, very frequent in Solak's film, and it's often created by the sets of Henri Ménessier. I really recommend you to go watch The Sewers during the Kennington on the Kennington Bioscope series. Another thing about The Sewer, it was a very impressive production design, and remarked by the press to Henri Ménessier's sets were remarked because they built whole sewers, which was really an attraction apparently in Fort Lee. And we can see here you have this article from 1912 where they mentioned the rats, the sewer, the traps, all the little tricks they had to construct for this set. And now I can't, sorry, and I have to go back to my PowerPoint because I can't advance it anymore. I just want to show you some of the sets of The Sewer, which are almost expressionist. It's a very beautiful film, and I would argue that the sets here supersedes a little bit the scenario. They're more interesting than the films themselves. But there is also an interesting anecdote that Alice Guy Blachet recounts about this film, because they were trained rats that they used, that they painted red so they can see it. And apparently Darwin Carr, after this film, said never again. He was really disgusted by the rats. You can see him, he has a very dramatic performance too. I really invite you to watch this film because the sets are extremely impressive, and you can see here the number of sets too is very impressive, and it's all like real sewers with water running through them. So it was very, probably very expensive and a very important production design. It's also a long film, it's a 20-minute film. And to finish, it's really as a teaser, I would say, to conclude my presentation for the importance of set design in Guy Blaché and Ménessier's film, is she often uses the artificiality of the studio or of modern technology as spaces of resistance or against a law, if you want. Brian Jacobson made a very compelling argument saying that the studio space was a performance of a controlled nature, and he analyzed this period of filmmaking and notably the settlement of studios in Fort Lee to make this argument. And in this film, Falling Leaves, you can see that little Trixie, the little Mike Dafoe, is going against nature, right? She's trying to challenge nature by retiring the leaves and stopping the death of her sister. Well, I would make the argument that Alice Guy Blaché often plays with the power that she can have through the studio space and to manipulate reality. And there is another very interesting films, and I don't know if those are the sets of Henri Ménessier, but that might answer a question that Céline had, where it's all about recorded sound. And here it's not only the sets that, but also recorded sound that goes against, that allows a young woman to go against the wishes of her father. So she is able to challenge a patriarchal law with technology and recorded sound. I went very, very fast, so we had time for questions.
But we do have a little bit of time.
But yeah, that's like points I wanted to just highlights in Guy Blaché's set design and production is like in Can Harmony is the importance of sound. In this film, it's the story about a young woman who wishes to marry her lover, but her father, who is a musician, only wants her to marry a musician. And so she tries to trick her father into believing that her lover is a musician by having him do a fake performance and having a chronophone record played under the chair. And so we have this wonderful shot on the left of her starting the chronophone where her lover pretends to play the violin. And she's able to marry her lover, even if at the end her trick is disguised, but her father still allows her to marry her lover. So here recorded sound really help a young woman to go against the patriarchal law. And I find interesting how really set design allows Guy Blaché to explore also, I don't know if I should say like more freedom for young women, but it's definitely something to explore. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to discussing all of this.
Okay, we're a little bit out of time now because we have the next thing, but I want to make a couple of comments just with between the two presentations, because I learned a lot of new things again today after our discussion a couple of days ago and our ongoing discussions. I thought that was interesting, Clara, when you made the point about the workers, that the women workers working in the laboratory, that Richard thought they may be American and you said they were probably French. I say this because if everyone joins us at 3 o'clock for the presentation on the Arte documentary, there's some great footage of young women in France working in factories, not just cinema factories, but in factories. And we know this, we've seen many photographs and images of women working in the color studios in Pathé. And I'm just, it sort of just boggles me if all these people are coming over from France. And there was a question in the chat that possibly you can refer to, Clara, about the, yes, we know the French invasion, but when you think of the competition within France and within Europe in the earlier period, they're coming to the States. Are they competing? You know, we can show some of those images of the Lemoyne House and duplicate footage, and possibly that these companies were actually sharing footage of the same scenes. We've identified footage like that. Clara can put up. We've found in 2 prints in the Library of Congress collection. On the left is a film, Fidelity. On the right is The Detective's Dog, where I've located the same scene of the dog running to save a young girl in both scenes. It looks identical. I would have to pull the 2 prints side by side, but this gives us a sense that are they sharing footage, these various companies? Are they not competing? Because Richard, you're talking about the vast investment required, and Brûlatour is obviously financing a great many of these French studios, but we still don't know who is financing the Blachets. Yes, Clara, you've told us that they've got the money from Gaumont from selling their shares, but is this going to sustain them to build a factory and to run a studio? I mean, it's this, and this is important because money is going to keep people a lot surviving in this period. And the sewer is an elaborate production. It's a feature. There's a lot of investment there. Dick Whittington, that's a year in 1913, is also a lot of investment. And the Blachets are investing in features, and can they sustain this economically? I mean, there are other factors, because it just seems to me they're sort of caught in what Richard said, that first it's the French invasion, but then it's the Americanization of cinema, which is really forcing, even if they're in the States, independent foreign producers out by the First World War. But I guess what's curious to me is that the French community is still sustaining beyond the First World War, but they're integrating perhaps more into the American industry. Because Capellani is staying there, Richard. He's still working in the later teens. I mean, there's still a spot for this community. It's not just the mid-teens. They're staying there. But anyway, back to the workers, the French laboratory workers coming over and being women. Who's sending them over? I mean, can we even get a grasp on this? How is this happening? Because this is an enormous investment.
Well, I don't know for Gaumont and for Eclair. The only thing I know is not my research, is, as I said, independent researchers who research their ancestor who came as a laboratory worker in 1904 for Pathé. And we know that Pathé was sending people to train thanks to their research. And what they told me is that Pathé was sending people and women to train American women in the laboratories. And so that asks the question of what were the other studios doing? What was Gaumont doing? I don't know if there are papers about this in the Gaumont papers. I have not been there, and so I don't know, but it's definitely a question to me, especially if in the Code of Life in 1909, as Richard showed, there were a French bakery in 1909. So I have no idea if, I mean, it's been a question for me about this and about the French network and French community in New Jersey around the filmmaking. Because
go ahead.
Because we know a lot about the cinematographers, we know even the set designers. I mean, we know about, a lot about the creative personnel, but we don't really know about the technical crew behind. And it seems like French studios were very proud of their technical crews, so they would want to import them because they would want their the French quality of filmmaking.
One thing we just have a couple of minutes, and Richard, when you describe the setting of the Palisades and why Fort Lee is attracting people, the first thing I thought of when you mentioned the military site there, you had mentioned that it wasn't viable as a military site. Well, there are a lot of Solax films and that do combine genre. It's a military story. And I was thinking that might have been the impetus for using that setting. Alice Guy was like Elvira Notari. She really had the sense of getting right in there and identifying something that could be advantageous to her. So we do know that there are a number of Solax military genre films. So that setting probably was ideal. Also in the Palisades, you mentioned the amusement company, all the stock players. We really don't know anything about the Solax players. We know their names, but we don't know anything about their careers, if they were in the theater. This is particularly important for A Fool and His Money. When I restored the film, Pearl Bowser had said she was sure that the players, the African-American players, were professional, and for sure they were. We know James Russell, a minstrel star and known as the Cakewalk King, he was well known, but the other people in the film are also probably well-known players. So I don't know where we would find this kind of information about actually people that were part of the stock company, because they are part of the signature along with the setting. We've mentioned the lighting. Definitely the Solax lighting is unique, as is the color, tinting, and toning, which they advertised since they were at Flushing. We don't know the connections between Gaumont and Solax in terms of that, but likely there was crisscrossing. The lighting enriches very much the mise-en-scène and setting in many of the films. And you're right, Clara, there is an atmospheric, I don't know how to describe it, a very openness in the mise-en-scène of the Solax films. It's very Pathé does not have that. The Eclair films, I've seen fewer of them, but I don't remember them having the same kind of setup. When you mentioned Menessier, the camera doesn't move, but he moved the set. Because if you look at the designs of many of the sets, they are clearly not just a frontal. Things are set up in a way that people move through the sets. And the camera also follows the players as they move through the sets in many of the films. In tonight's program, A Comedy of Errors, you will see that as the players move through rooms. So you get a sense of it, how extending space. Anyway, we don't really have a lot of time because I'm on very soon. Thank you very much. I think we've learned a lot between both panels. Everyone, please remember to watch the Kennington Bioscope program, which is up until the end of June. And I'll see you at 3.